"Take care," Manhard said. I wished him good luck. My firing position was on the rise overlooking the lake. Across the water, at a distance of 1 kilometre, was the hamlet of Senozero, where the men of our 2 battalions were fighting for their lives. The Russians had managed to block all overland access. Our breakthrough over the lake was to be launched from our landing place at an inlet to our left, concealed from the enemy's sight. Once the boats had emerged from behind a rib jutting out into the lake, parallel to the south edge, they would have to cross the open water and be exposed to enemy fire. Our task was to suppress the machine guns across the lake to the right. Dazzled by the sun, I found it impossible to spot them through my binoculars under their camouflage. We would have to wait for their tracers to betray their positions. Stricker rammed his mount into the soft ground on the rise. Bing threw his gun into the traversing and elevating mechanism, adjusting the sight for the estimated range to the enemy's positions across the lake. We were ready. At 7 sharp, our artillery and mortars broke loose. From our privileged position, we could see the impacts flashing along a line where we imagined the Russians' eastern positions and gun emplacements to be. In spite of the noise, we could hear the engines of our boats revving up to a deep roar. Soon they shot out from the inlet, 2 side by side, then another 2, then 4, and eventually 6, bows rising above the water, light machine guns in front. The men crouched on the bottom, the propellers leaving white, foaming tail waves behind. Only the coxswains stood upright at the stern, both hands gripping the handles of the driving shafts mounted on rowlocks on the stern posts of the boats. As soon as they came out in the open, the coxswains sharply swung the tillers to the right, using the motors to steer and causing the boats to swerve to the left in a wild arc, now heading directly for the opposite shore. A fascinating sight. The boats were very fast. Still, they were only boats, presenting fine targets for infantry fire. The Russians remained silent at first, either due to surprise or the ceaseless covering fire from our heavy weapons. After seemingly endless minutes, the boats shot into an inlet on the opposite shore. The battalion commander, Manhard, and the other men of the first wave had made it safely so far. This action was only the beginning of the mission, however. After a while, the first boats appeared back on the lake, heading for the rib on our side. Through my binoculars, I saw they were full of wounded. The Ivans seemed to have recovered from their surprise. Bursts of tracers swept over the lake, fired from 2 machine guns to the right. Now came our job. We knew where they were. Bing sent his tracers over, individual shots at first, then long, sustained bursts. So far, I couldn't see an effect. Meanwhile, the boats, widely dispersed, with roaring engines, dashed across the lake in wide swerves to evade the shower of enemy fire, which we could see whizzing across them or lashing the water's surface. Heinrich joined in with his gun, rattling through a whole belt. Now it seemed our fire was taking effect. One enemy gun was silent, although the other kept firing. But the boats were getting away from the danger zone. One after another they turned into the inlet. They had won again. By now, though, the Ivan had realized what was at stake. If they let our reinforcements come across the lake, it could endanger their entire operation. At any rate, our staging area and our firing positions on the south edge of Senozero now became the main target of their artillery and mortars. Hell broke loose. Heavy artillery rounds came slamming down on the staging site to our left, mostly shells from the infamous Ratschbum, 76 mm high-velocity guns, the impact of which arrived faster than the sound of their firing report. Just when, amid all that turmoil, the second wave of our boats had taken off, their course and our firing positions on the rise came under concentrated Russian fire. We had no time to dig in, but found some cover between the large rocks cropping out of the terrain. So when the boats reached the open water and the 2 machine guns opened fire on them, we blasted away as best we could. We counted the artillery firings and took cover whenever the shells crashed down, then popped up again to send our bursts toward the Russian machine gun nests. By then our fire was much more precise, temporarily putting the 2 machine guns out of action. My full admiration goes to the coxswains of the engineer battalion who, in stoic, upright positions at the stern, kept steering their boats through the hail of machine gun fire and the impacts of falling mortar shells. They drove through not once, but again and again, always facing another ride through enemy fire once they reached the shore unharmed. Relentlessly, the Russian artillery kept firing, sending shells into the staging area and duelling with our own guns. Thanks to their closeness to the railway line in their rear, they outpaced our own artillery. We waited for the boats to return. Charpeur ordered a change of position down to the edge of the lake. On our crest, the enemy fire had become too dangerous. I looked for a favourable spot and quickly, between two rounds of artillery, started down the hill, jumping from cover to cover toward a rock formation above the lake. Then Berger fell. It was nearly a direct hit by a stray round. He got hit as he ran down, the last in line and fully loaded with ammunition boxes. I sent one of my men back for help, but he soon returned, his face ashen. Berger was dead. The boats were back on the lake, evacuating more wounded. This time the barrage of Russian mortars increased. The boats had no choice. They abandoned their zigzag course and shot straight through that hail of fire. One of the Russian machine guns was back in action. Its tracers whizzed through the middle of the little fleet. With the concentrated fire of our two guns, we silenced it again. But before we did, one of the coxswains was hit. His craft swerved wildly over the water. Someone in the boat took hold of the tiller and eventually brought the boat back to the inlet. The heavy weapons fire on both sides escalated to a fury, and the outcome was becoming more than doubtful. At that moment, the Stukas came. It had been years since they had been in action in this sector. Normally, they operated far off, mainly occupied with the American convoys on the Arctic Ocean. That they were sent to help us could only mean the army saw the whole front endangered if things went wrong at Senozero. It was a formation of 3, looking like birds of prey with their gull wings, clumsy undercarriage and camouflage paint. And they acted as such as they swooped down on the Russian artillery emplacements and on the enemy's infantry positions. Their nerve-wracking wail, swelling anew with every dive, completed the picture of absolute dominance over their victims. For them, it must have been a nightmare. The tide turned. Under cover of the Stukas, the assault boats shot over the lake unmolested. The next time, they carried only ammunition and supplies. Clouds of smoke rose over the Russian emplacements. Maybe an Senozero 127 ammunition dump had been hit. Their artillery and mortar fire had almost stopped for the time being. Now the Stukas, guided by flares, turned upon some of the Russian infantry positions, ferociously blasting away with their cannon. At last, they swept once more across the battlefield and then took off. Our opponent had been taken by surprise a second time on this day, and his morale was shaken. Later on, the sun was behind us. The fighting had ebbed. By turns, we took naps. Awakened and instantly recalling the events of the last 12 hours, however, everything appeared strangely unreal. The everlasting daylight, the lack of sleep, and our general exhaustion may have added to that dreamlike condition. Behind us, however, up the hill, just where he had been hit, Berger lay under the speckled canvas spread over his body. Thinking back, I recalled our talks in the bunker. With all his plain and unconditional devotion to the Führer, his will to live might have been stronger, if on this morning there had been for him some kind of choice. There wasn't, though, and so he died with his loyalty untainted. In the early afternoon we were called back. Cautiously we pulled out and leapt up the dangerous forward slope, dragging the canvas with Berger's body along. To our surprise, the Russians left us alone. On our way back to the assembly area, we went through a hollow where a row of stretchers had been put down with the rest of the casualties who had just been rescued from the pocket. Some of them looked frightfully pale and haggard. I saw the wounded commander who had been relieved. He was obviously unshaven for days and had one arm bandaged up. He was squatting by a young officer who was lying on a stretcher with a waxen face. The commander, seeing us pass by, asked us to move the stretcher out of the sun. He remained with the wounded man, soothingly talking to him and holding him by the hand. "You'll be all right. They'll fix you up in no time." But the young officer was dying, and he knew he was. Just before he lost consciousness, I heard him whisper to his commander, "Do never, never forsake the Führer." It is only now that I realize that up there in the wilderness on that day, we saw a dying officer seeking to extend his loyalty even beyond his death. In spite of all we had been through, we were not meant to enjoy a rest. Some rations, some tea, half an hour of bottomless sleep was all we got, and possibly could expect under the circumstances. There was another urgent mission waiting for us, and there were also the wounded who had to be brought back to the field hospital as soon as possible. What was there to say? Was any unit engaged in this operation better off? And weren't we lucky so far in comparison to the casualties that had been sustained by other units? So, stoically, once more we got up to distribute our equipment among ourselves and went over to pick up the wounded. True, this time the load was lighter than the one with which we had arrived, and hadn't we shot a lot of ammunition? As we took up the stretchers and started balancing our moaning burden towards the path we had come up this morning, though, it was hard to believe we could do it again. We hadn't realized for days the full purpose of our next mission. We figured that the combat group at Senozero, even with reinforcements, would be unable to break out of the pocket without massive help from the outside. Indeed, we thought our comrades inside would be lucky to escape annihilation. What we didn't know was that a battalion of SS Mountain Infantry Regiment 12 was working forward through the swamps on the northern edge of the lake to get the Russian attack force from the rear. Our task, as it turned out later, was to search the area south of Senozero for the left flank of the Russians and launch holding attacks to bind its forces. After we had delivered the wounded at the landing place, we started back on the trail, but soon left it and turned eastward. From now on, we were moving into a region that was unknown terrain. Up to then, no one had bothered to carry out even reconnaissance patrols in this area between Senozero and Yeletsozero. It was considered impenetrable for any substantial force. The Jaeger are said to be a quick-moving unit in difficult terrain, but this terrain beat all we had experienced. The wood was full of all sorts of obstacles, trunks lying all over the terrain, underbrush, rocky barriers, water and bogs, which, again and again, posed new problems for our progress. Pillars of old conifers scattered in the green surroundings, completely dried-up trunks with their bark long gone, and now showing a smooth, silver-grey surface, had been dead for a long time, but were in their stern erectness a symbol of perseverance in the harsh climate of this latitude. Except for the steady rumble of the artillery, the area was eerily still. The continual absence of darkness and the bizarre light of the sun lingering about the horizon for hours and hours added to the awe I think most of us felt as we penetrated this unknown wild. We were with the 13th Company, first in single line following the trailblazers who had been sent ahead, and then in skirmish line, stalking through the more open terrain. We had been walking for hours when we almost ran across a Russian supply route leading to the lake. We attacked instantly, and in no time a wild fight with all manner of small arms broke out. As the Ivan's resistance stiffened, we realized we had run into a reinforcement unit which we couldn't defeat. We withdrew and made ourselves invisible by digging in. We found a place for our gun on a rib with a good field of fire amidst the swampy ground. Improvised as this position was, we were to remain there for the next 6 weeks. While the fight for Senozero went on, we did everything to make life for the Russians' left flank as uncomfortable as possible. During the first weeks, few days passed without attacks by one side or the other at this improvised front line. Our protection against artillery fire was poor. Because of the constant hostile fire, we couldn't even think of fortifications. Anyone moving in daylight in an upright position immediately took fire. Still, in the short hours of semi-darkness, we managed to cover our hole with a makeshift roof of poles and canvas to protect against the rain that had started, while underneath we constructed a grid to protect us from the water that accumulated in the bottom of our hole. The position remained throughout little more than a patrol post. Polzer was killed next, the second one of my gun crew to be lost at Senozero. He went out of our life so quietly that at first we didn't notice. He was on guard duty when an artillery barrage started. The moment the fire stopped, I crawled from my hole and saw him sitting as usual behind our gun. When he didn't answer my call, I thought nothing of it, anxious to check up on the other ones first. It was only when I got on his side to peer over the parapet that I noticed him slumped into a heap, his cheeks ashen, his eyes staring into the void. A small wound at his left temple was the only sign of the shrapnel that had penetrated his skull, just under the brim of his helmet. By the end of July, the Russians stopped their attacks against our stronghold at Senozero. Our sister regiment had broken through the encirclement, reinforcements had gone in, and further Russian onslaughts against the bulwark, which had claimed so many lives on the Russian side, appeared fruitless. Our division had prevailed, and we were cited in the High Command's daily bulletin for it. At our front line, the Russians seemed to have vanished from the area. So, after a few days, we started a major reconnaissance patrol into hostile territory, which lasted a full day. We advanced in wedge-like formation, stopping time and again, guarding and stalking on. Indian warfare, we called it. We would search the greenness with binoculars for any distant enemy or conspicuous objects that possibly conceal a foxhole or a gun close by. We looked for a mound strangely out of place, an upright trunk cut off head high, underbrush that might turn out to be a screen, a piece of birch bark with a rectangular cutout, particularly hard to notice marks of our opponent's camouflage we had learned to look for. We were lucky on this day and managed to take some prisoners. In the short clash we had with the enemy, however, the Alter was wounded. A bullet in the arm smashed his upper arm bone. Heinrich was put in charge of the Alter's gun. Paradoxically, it was in a setting of great beauty that our mission neared its end. Ruska, the colour changes associated with autumn, had come to the wilderness between Senozero and Yeletsozero. It had emerged from the rains and the chilly nights of the end of August. An explosion of colours turning the green of the birches yellow, the feathery leaves of the mountain ashes pink, and the dark green bushes of mulberries and cranberries, covering most of the ground, flaming red. Now, in the bright sun that had come out again, even the thick layers of lichen on the rocks and on the trunks in decay were a rich copper patina. At that time, however, we didn't appreciate the glory of the setting. Our minds were occupied with our primeval environment and grim warfare. Having stayed there for so many weeks without relief, our life was wretched and reduced to the bare needs of survival, eating, keeping warm, resting, and still exercising the vigilance essential for staying alive in this Indian war. In particular, we were totally unaware of the greater events afoot at that time. It was only a few days later that things in Finland were to take an unexpected turn. The bugle call of taps is sounding from the tower of our new post. The solemn beauty of the signal, blown in a pure and stable portuto, invites all the men herded together in this compound, American soldiers and German prisoners alike, to a mood of calmness and melancholy. It is May now, the second year of our captivity. It's been over 2 months now since I finished the last chapter, the one about Senozero. The hospital cage at Romilly had been shut down as the PW camp quickly emptied. They say most of the prisoners have been turned over to the French, others have been discharged, such as the sick and those with some privileged status. Walter's Austrian citizenship, for instance, has miraculously been reinstated, and he has been consequently discharged. Most of us, the staff of the hospital, however, have been picked for service with the US military police school that is being set up here in Germany. Actually, we are some sort of a royal household, recruited from the human resources of the Romilly camp. Orderlies ranging from butlers to footmen, waiters, male nurses, cooks and other kitchen personnel, craftsmen of all sorts, gardeners, musicians, a whole orchestra, coachmen, drivers, janitors, and so on. We are even liveried with neat GI clothes, adorned with a large white PW on the back, or dyed totally black. The new post is a former German Navy barracks downriver from Bremen. Strangely enough, the Allied bombers left it almost unharmed, while razing the cities both north and south of us. The urban areas were particularly hard hit. Now, the barracks' red brick buildings, homelike in comparison with the bleak French barracks, accommodate the US military police school since we moved to this place during the first half of this month. We, the prisoners, put up our tents within a rectangular cage, surrounded by barbed wire and guarded by sentries stationed at the entrance and on 2 watchtowers, same as ever. To be back home but still imprisoned intensifies the feeling of being held in captivity. When, after so many delays, our train finally left Romilly, it seemed a promising start. Somehow, our future appeared brighter. We were going home, and that notion alone was sufficient to fill us with anticipation. The further we rolled into Germany, the more I felt elated. Every hour I felt I was coming closer to my home. Then, for a while, we could even see the Harz Mountains emerging from the haze in the east. From then on, rolling on to the north, however, disappointment grew. The dreadful wounds our country had suffered in the long agony of the last years of the war became more and more manifest as we passed through the stations, towns, and industrial sites. But what exactly had we expected? Some kind of miracle? We passed through Mannheim, Kassel, Hanover, and Bremen. Had we imagined on our journey back that somehow they would have been resurrected from their ruins? We faced a grim reality. Between islands of devastation, the farmland and the villages presented themselves in the full blossom of May. Symbols of hope abounded in every field, in every cluster of red-tiled roofs, and every stand of chestnut trees. Along the way, something came back to my mind, something from a French lesson at school in the summer of 1940, the time when France had been defeated. Our teacher had chosen a quotation from a recent address by Marshal Pétain, words that had deeply impressed me because, at that time, I was trying to imagine the feelings of a defeated nation. The text was an appeal to the French nation for an intellectual and moral recovery. As our train rolled on, I tried to recall the words the Marshal had used to invoke the French soil as a last resort, something like this. Français, la terre dit ne ment pas, elle demeure notre recours, elle est la patrie elle-même. Un champ qui tombe en friche, c'est une portion de France qui meurt. Un champ de nouveau emblavé, c'est une portion de France qui renaît. Frenchman, the land does not forsake us. It remains our refuge. It is our country as such. A field that falls fallow is a portion of France that dies. A field tilled anew is a portion of France that is born again. Words of hope and encouragement. If only we were free so we could help with our country's rebirth. Freedom and liberty were the subjects of a recent conversation among our chaplain, Pete, and me. We were standing around after the consecration of our new chapel, which of course is also under canvas, where Pete had dragged me in. In his sermon, the chaplain had been trying to soothe the general disappointment by invoking faith and hope. Faith, he said, that could be practiced in the camp as well as outside, and hope that was like a beam from a lighthouse, as strong and promising as our faith. Pete expressed how much he had liked the sermon and that he was edified by it. I felt I should say something as well. I'm sorry, chaplain, I haven't been much of a churchgoer at home, but I can understand that people feel consoled. Hope gets stronger if it is shared with others in faith. And what about yourself? He asked, smiling, feeling my reservations. I'm not blessed with too much hope, I'm afraid. It must be my faith which isn't as strong as it should be. Somehow I feel trapped. I'm very sorry for you, he said. Don't you at least agree with what was said about freedom? I understand your subject was freedom of will and freedom of worship as a last resort in our predicament. It's true. With all due respect, chaplain, our real problem is that we want to get out of here. That's what I think freedom is all about. Yes, I understand. Still, I insist. Even outside, you won't be as free as you might think. There are always moral obligations or legal requirements or naked want that will restrain your freedom. I dare say that in this cage there is more freedom than you have experienced in the last few years as a soldier. Don't you think so? I don't hesitate to go even further. You may even say in our defeat we were liberated. Although I had heard this view before, I was shocked. How can you say that? Must I remind you of the bombed-out citizens of Bremen or of the millions of people who were expelled from the East? Do you think they feel liberated? As for me, I volunteered for service. That's just what I mean. You were bound by moral obligations, bound by your own will as others are by custom or religion. It's always the spiritual sphere where the most compelling restrictions of freedom originate, and since you are free of your former bondage, you are left with a greater freedom which you can make use of in here. As I see it, one bondage of my own choice has been replaced by another bondage which isn't my choice at all. The main choice is between a life toward God or away from Him, and in that you are free. The one who really believes will always be free to lead a life that pleases God. That is the message. Always? How about life under Bolshevism? Would you say those people are free in your sense? I doubt that. I doubt that very much. Assuming you were right, though, then we could put up with Bolshevism. It wouldn't be that bad after all. Is that your message? The statute of the IMT is as legal and binding as any law. But is it fair and just? I insisted. It was set up afterwards, wasn't it? There wasn't any war criminal code in the 1930s. I have read that by proceeding as they are violating an old legal principle that a defendant may not be punished without being warned by law beforehand. They say this principle has come down to us from the Romans and is established in all civilized legal systems. That's a very formal objection. Don't let yourself be confused by it. You can't seriously deny that crimes against humanity, such as murder, rape, deportation, and various other crimes, have been well-established crimes for centuries, some at least for many decades, among civilized nations. Yes, I can see that. Violation of human rights, I admitted. However, the more all parties became involved in an uncompromising, all-out war, in a war for their own survival, the more those well-established rules of mankind began to crumble on all sides. Must I go further into that? In general, I agreed that violations of human rights must be prosecuted, but not so with the newly established crimes. I said so and continued, what about the so-called crime of preparing a war of aggression, the main crime, the crime number 1 of the trial? That has never been a punishable crime before, or has it? Well, it remains to be seen whether the court will bring in a verdict of guilty on that point, the captain said. But at least it has been claimed by distinguished jurists that, after World War I, wars of aggression were regarded as banned within the international community. I felt encouraged by the captain's quiet way of explaining the legal aspects of the procedure and continued my probe. There's another question that haunts me since I've read the notification of the IMT in our cage back in France, the provisions on conspiracy and on the criminal character of certain organizations. What really upsets me is the obvious intention of criminalizing even regular combat units, such as the Waffen-SS. On my mentioning the Waffen-SS, the captain's jovial manner became somewhat subdued. He continued, however, to play the role of tutor to pupil. You certainly are aware, he said, that the criminal character of the SS is obvious to most people nowadays, Germans and non-Germans alike, aren't you? Now it's my turn to ask, do I need to go into that further? The court certainly will. I was on dangerous ground, but to break up our conversation at this point would have left too big a question mark in his mind, so I continued. Let me explain, sir. A friend of mine was an officer of the Waffen-SS, a man of irreproachable character and impeccable war conduct. He was killed in action. From what I have read in the papers, it must be concluded that if the court should pronounce the Waffen-SS guilty, he would become, posthumously, a criminal just by joining that branch of the forces in 1942. All the more, the survivors of these units would be considered criminals, regardless of their personal guilt. What about the principle of personal accountability you speak of in your lectures? How is it embodied in the statute of the IMT? The captain got up and cast me a pensive glance. He went over to the shelf, looking for something special. With a jerk, he drew an old paper from under a heap of material and held in his hands what he wanted, the statute of the IMT. After some leafing through the document, he quoted from Article 9 and 10 of the statute. The court may in the trial against a single member of a group or an organization, in connection with an action the defendant will be found guilty of, declare the group or organization of which the defendant was a member a criminal organization. In that case, any of the four powers may bring a former member of the organization to trial, and that, in this case, the criminal character of the organization shall not be questioned. The captain thought about the text for a while, then continued. I don't think that personal culpability will be disregarded in the case of members of the organizations. If the court should find an organization guilty in the sense of Article 9, it will certainly make provisions for groups of members whose guilt may be questionable. On the other hand, if we are determined to bring justice to those who have suffered from the actions of the SS, it would be intolerable to allow any defendant to raise anew the question of whether the SS was a criminal organization. I felt Captain Herbert was playing down the charge against the Waffen-SS. Forgive my insisting, sir, but it is a criminal conspiracy those soldiers I mentioned were charged with. Conspiracy for the commitment of crimes against peace, of war crimes, and of crimes against humanity. I find it inconceivable even to suggest that hundreds of thousands of soldiers could have joined this part of the German forces to commit crimes. And how can that be proven? There is not even one member of the Waffen-SS in the dock. The captain remained quite composed, almost impassive. For him, the trial seemed to be just another criminal procedure. He thought for a while, then said, As I said before, there are many who think that the crimes of the SS were generally known, so that he who joined one of their organizations must have seen himself as becoming an instrument of crime. Personally, however, I have my doubts that the charge of a conspiracy can be upheld in general. The term as such is a rather disputed one, even in the United States. Maybe the court won't consider it as part of the law of nations. I thought it best to leave it at that. Our talk had gone far enough. One day in early September 1944, the news broke that the Finns and the Soviets had agreed to an armistice. At that time, I wasn't with the battalion, but was staying in the field hospital. The news spread like wildfire through the wards. Soon it became known that the Finns had been negotiating in Moscow for quite a long time behind our backs. The German Lapland army was to leave Finland by the 15th of September. It came to us as a blow. How could we get out of Finland in less than 2 weeks? What if we didn't? A few days later, there was more news. The Finnish army was bound by the terms of the armistice to expel the German army from their territory by that date. To us, it seemed inconceivable that our brothers in arms would turn their weapons against us. Oddly enough, our friendly feelings for the Finns remained almost unchanged, and so did our great respect for the brave people who in 1939 preferred to wage war rather than submit to the intimidations of the Soviets, as the Baltic states had done. After all, both our peoples were bound by history and geography to stop the Bolsheviks' expansion to the west. Hadn't we fought bravely side by side all these years against our common enemy? In my ward was an engineer sergeant with a puncture wound on his upper arm, one of the boatmen who had steered the assault boats across Senozero and had been decorated with the German Cross in gold, a medal for valour ranking between the Iron Cross First Class and the Knight's Cross. He thought our prospects of winning the war had become more than doubtful, and said so quite frankly. He found it quite reasonable that the Finns would quit as long as there was an opportunity for them to preserve their own national existence. Who were we to blame them? He asked. The German withdrawal through Finland, September-October 1944. Finnish-Soviet border before the Winter War, and from July 1941 to the 15th of September 1944. Finnish-Soviet border until the 15th of September 1944. Finnish-Soviet border after the 15th of September 1944. Route of withdrawal of 20 T-cells. Mountain Corps, 163rd and 169th Infantry Divisions and supporting units. Route of withdrawal of T-8. Mountain Corps, 6th, 55th and 7th Mountain Divisions, Division Group Krautler and supporting units. Route of withdrawal of Ting Mountain Corps, 3rd and 6th Mountain Divisions, 210th Infantry Division, Division Group Vanderhoop and supporting units. Major Finnish towns occupied by Soviets after withdrawal of German forces. In the leisure of hospital life, however, We had a lot of time to speculate on our future. If the inconceivable should happen, wouldn't we be utterly exposed, in particular our division at the south flank of the German Lapland army, and dangerously isolated, even from our own troops in the Arctic? Weren't we in for a losing battle? Or could we possibly survive somewhere in the vast regions of the woodland, fend for ourselves as individual battalions or regiments? As a Jaeger regiment, we could perhaps live on game, mushrooms, and berries like Indians. We knew, however, that the noise of the weapons had driven all game from the woods in recent years. Maybe we could keep cows and sheep, organize some sort of stock farming, and wait in seclusion for the war to end. Our imaginations knew no bounds, but never in our talks did the thought of surrender enter our minds. We knew that the Finnish option was not for us. For us, it was either victory or unconditional surrender. This choice was the grim truth, since the Allies had announced their war aims at Casablanca, and thus had rendered the war total. There was no choice but to carry on, one way or another. We soon realized that we couldn't stay in Lapland for long. Somehow we had to fight our way back home. In spite of all the uncertainty, I was enjoying my vacation in this clean and smoothly run lake resort. At night, however, lying awake in the dark and thinking of the battalion that soon was to disengage from the enemy, my own disengagement from our position out there between the two lakes 1 week earlier went through my mind. I had awakened from a wild dream. The night between the Senozero and Yeletsozero had been clear and chilly. I felt a pain throbbing in my right ankle and rising up my leg. It had become worse overnight, although I had loosened my boots before lying down. I could not remember having them off during the last 5 weeks. When I started trembling, feeling really silly about it, it slowly dawned on me that I had a high fever. The next thing I found out was that my left side was sodden. The water under the grid of thin poles we had managed to install in our rat hole for 2 must have risen overnight. Cautiously, I crawled out, not too confident of what I would see when I took off my boot. But as much as I tried, it didn't come off. It was immovably stuck on my foot. Damn, I should have gone to see the medic days ago. But how could I have risked being sent to the rear and leaving my comrades just for a sore foot? Bing, sitting on guard 10 meters away behind our MG, turned round as he heard me swearing to myself. "Anything wrong? How is your foot today?" he asked in the subdued voice we had gotten used to on our standing patrol. "I'm fine. It's just that my ankle is twice its normal size. The pain is rising up my leg. I'm dizzy as if I was drunk. Not to mention that I can't walk." He got the picture right away. "Hey, sounds as if you need some help. Let me get someone to take you to the medic. Come on, take over the gun for a moment. It won't be long." He had come up and helped me crawl over to the gun. Walking upright was still dangerous here. "That doesn't look good. No good at all," the medic said when he had managed to cut open my boot and had taken a look at my ankle. "If this isn't operated on immediately, I can't guarantee your leg," he added gloomily. "Off to the field hospital right away." From then on, my memory is blurred. I was really ill by now. They put me on a litter, and somehow, later on that day, I found myself back at the spot I knew so well, the lakeside where we first had come across the assault boats and where we had brought back the wounded from the lake. There were more litter cases around. The ferry, still in operation, took us across the lake. On the other side, at the small post, I was strapped to a strange Finnish means of transportation, primitive but, as it turned out, highly convenient. A flat, rectangular frame of young spruce poles, its top ends sticking out as thills, was harnessed to a mule, while its lower ends rested on and were meant to be dragged along the ground. In the middle of the frame, a stretcher was mounted, its reclined position forming an obtuse angle with the frame. I barely noticed the mule getting a slap on its hind quarters when it started off on the trail into the woods, all by itself and obviously quite familiar with its job. So, all alone with the mule, I found myself trailing over the soft ground, the flexible frame gently swinging up and down in a steady motion, while I watched the vivid mixture of green conifers and colourful foliage gliding by like a film on Karelian Ruska. The later trip on the road in an ambulance was dreadful. The vehicle jolted up and down on the worn wooden planks, intolerably increasing the pain. We reached the field hospital in the evening. The doctor opened up the abscess and removed a great deal of pus. A field hospital is, in comparison to the front line, a news centre. Hardly a week after the news of the Finnish-Soviet armistice was released, we learned that a detailed contingency plan had been prepared for the German Lapland army to withdraw through Finland to the far north, where it borders Norway. Under this plan, our division would cover the army's southern flank, which would be open to any conceivable action of the Soviet and Finnish forces, and which in the beginning extended over a range of 300 kilometres from the eastern front lines to Oulu by the Gulf of Bothnia. In fact, our division was to form the army's rear guard on its march to the Norwegian border. In doing so, the two mountain infantry regiments, 11 and 12, were to alternately displace or leapfrog past one another along the route. The other units of the division were to be kept at the disposal of the Lapland army. Of the huge distance to Norway, we had only a vague notion. The distance was some 900 kilometres, as we were to learn step by step in the coming months. The large wound at my ankle, once sewn up, healed quickly. The field hospital was already busily preparing for displacement westward to Kuusamo. Before we left, I wanted to look at Berger's grave in our nearby division cemetery. The sergeant went with me. When we got there, we found a detachment occupied with taking down the live runes of birch from the long rows of graves. In one corner, they had already begun to work the place with heavy equipment to remove all signs of its former dedication. In the course of our withdrawal, as in any military retrograde operation, it was only natural that we would destroy any of our installations that could be of use to the Russians, particularly lodges, cabins, and bunkers that had enabled us to survive in winter. We knew that. We were not prepared, though, for what we had to see now. They said it was a measure of safeguarding the peace of the dead after all our troops had experienced in the Russian campaign. But watching the scene, our hearts were full of grief and despair, soothed only by the promise to those left unnamed in foreign soil. You shall never be forgotten. When I got back to the battalion, it was already well on the way to Kuusamo. I met my comrades at a small place called Tukala. 1 week after the armistice, the division withdrew from its positions between the northern flank and Kiestinki. Under the cover of darkness, our battalion had slipped out of its bunkers, foxholes, and burrows, unnoticed and unmolested by the enemy. We were in for trouble when it was our regiment's turn to be the rear guard on the road from Kiestinki to Kuusamo. Somewhere in between was Tukala, a small settlement on a peninsula near the road some 40 kilometres west of Kiestinki. In hot pursuit, the Russians were relentlessly pressuring us from behind, trying to bypass our regiment as we slowly fell back to the west in a long, strung-out column. As long as the wilderness on both sides of the road receded far enough and the view widened, the men in the columns felt relatively secure. Most of the time, however, when the woods and the thick underbrush closed in, a funny feeling crept over them and stirred their hope that the regiment's rear guard wouldn't let itself be bypassed. Nevertheless, as it happened, on the night after I rejoined my squad, the Russians outflanked us and managed to set up 2 roadblocks, west and east of Tukala, respectively. Thus the regiment was cut off from the division, and, as if that wasn't enough, it was split apart. From my position overlooking a deep ravine with a bridge at the bottom, I had a view of the road winding westward up the opposite slope. Somewhere up in that wooded terrain, the Russians had ensconced themselves in blocking positions on the road. Repeated attacks from our side failed to achieve a breakthrough. Indeed, at that time, the regiment was fully occupied with trying to remove the other roadblock east of Tukala to link up with the cut-off rear guard. From the noise of infantry weapons, we imagined it was over there that the real fighting was taking place. The longer it lasted, the more we became aware of how uncertain our chances were of getting out of this precarious situation. Hours passed away. Was our withdrawal already to end here, deep in Russian territory? Finally, the firing behind us died out. We learned that the rear guard had broken free and that the regiment was reunited. Soon, preparations for cracking the western blockade became visible. Several Jaeger companies arrived and crossed the bridge to reinforce the units opposite the roadblock. My gun crew was ordered to strengthen the northern flank of the bridge. On my way down, I spotted two 2cm quadruple flak wagons rushing westward over the bridge. Meanwhile, it was clear that our attack was directly imminent. Suddenly, I spotted our battalioner in the sidecar of his motorcycle among the general bustle, giving orders, shouting at the men by the road, and organising the breakout. Although we were in a critical situation, the presence of the battalioner in our midst and his visible, resolute leadership conveyed a feeling of confidence to all of us. The two 2cm quadruple anti-aircraft guns opened fire on the Russian positions on the road. At the same time, one Jaeger company went through the woods on the side and pushed into the Russian flank from the north. At that same moment, the frontal attack began along the road. 3 companies stormed forward in a single thrust, the battalioner in front, firing from the hip like all his men, sweeping them along until the Russian positions had been overrun and knocked off the road. We followed, immediately securing the flanks against counterattacks by the Russians who had withdrawn into the woods. Meanwhile, the main force of the regiment flowed westwards behind us. It was a complete success. As we marched out of the pocket, we were received with a standing ovation by a battalion of Regiment 12 that had been rushed back for support and was now resting on both sides of the road. There had been casualties on our side, among them 3 officers, and most painful of all, 2 machine-gun squads that had been left by the bridge to cover our retreat and had been unable to disengage from the enemy. It was our last fight with the Russians. We had no further orders to delay the enemy pursuit and therefore reached the Finnish-Russian border unharmed a few days later. As I recall my time with the battalion on Russian territory, I can't think of any actions that could have tarnished our battalion's honour. It is also my firm belief that this notion is true of the other units. Like all the comrades I knew, I was proud to serve with this division. Was it only good luck? Would we have acted dishonourably if confronted with more difficult situations other than plain combat where friend and foe were clearly distinguished? I don't know. I think our sense of honour wasn't much different from the sense of honour of any normal military unit. Nor did we look down on the Russian soldier. How could we, in the face of the Battle of Senozero, or for that matter the bold encircling manoeuvre we had just experienced? I think the volunteers' only ambition was to excel as good soldiers. What we probably had on both sides were human beings who didn't want to die young, who loved and were loved, and who were ready to achieve something good in so far as they understood it. The girl dragged him inside. Of the sermon he understood not a single word, but he was, he said, touched by the inviting, simple interior, the hewn logs for walls and the brass chandeliers shimmering in the candlelight. There was some singing, and when they left, walking by the belfry in the churchyard, they enjoyed the glistening snow and the chiming bells. Soon after, the girl was posted elsewhere. He hadn't heard of her since. She must have lost his field mail number. Now, back in Kusamo on retreat and revisiting the church, it had struck him that the bells would be irretrievably lost if they weren't taken care of before the Russians came in. The next day he went to see the commander of the engineers, who, fortunately, was understanding, especially after Manhard had stimulated his professional ambition by suggesting that maybe it was more than he could possibly accomplish. Lottasvard was a Finnish women's organisation, wearing light grey uniforms and doing various kinds of service in support of the Finnish army, often within short distance of the front line. Its members were generally called Lottas. I said it was a great thing to do and that it said something about why we had been here all these years. "Don't put too much into it," he replied. "It's one of the few things we can do for the poor people without too much effort. Who knows what we'll be forced to do to them in the future if their army won't let us withdraw in peace." "Do you really think they'll turn against us, now that the time for our retreat has run out?" "Well, it won't be long before we'll find out. I'm on my way to Kemi. My battalion is stationed now between Kemi and Oulu." "How come? It's not the direct way to Norway." "Yes, but the High Command is worried about the area down there. They think the terrain makes it likely that the Finns will build up a force for a major action against our southern flank." "You seem to be quite well informed. People like me wouldn't know about that," I remarked. He laughed. "Come on now. I'm just a humble frontline officer, not much different from you. It's just a coincidence that the other day I met someone higher up who let me have a glimpse of the overall situation. He had first-hand information about the strong pressure the Russians are putting on the Finnish command to drive us out of the country. I heard some details on our contingency plan as well. It's dubbed Burke, by the way, and he told me how important our rear guard mission will be for the southern corps of the Lapland Army. So what's his judgment on the plan? Can it be done? He said it's never been done before in military history, but he is confident. Much depends on how things develop in the Kemi area. We were back at the church by now. In the meantime, they had managed to haul down the bells, which were lying on their side by the tower in the churchyard. I recall Manhard saying, as he looked up the empty belfry, "I hope I'll return to this place with the girl one day. The 2 bells buried in the ground are my token." When in that instant our eyes met for a short moment, however, both of us saw the fright in each other's eyes and the ambiguity of what he had just said. His driver pulled up with his motorcycle, and we said goodbye. A few hours later, dusk had fallen on the village. The battalion was formed up in a square. Hansen's husky voice sounded over the place. "Kameraden, tonight we are beginning a long march. It will last for months and will not end until we have reached a seaport by the Arctic Ocean. As you know, Finland's capitulation has left us without choice. We have to withdraw from a country that we helped defend against Bolshevism, our common enemy. Finland's eastern border stretches more than 1,000 kilometers. It couldn't have been defended without us. Against all odds, dictated by climate and geography and unequal human resources, we have prevailed. And if the Finns are to continue to exist as a free nation, they will do so because of our joint efforts over the past 3 years. So, although we are withdrawing, we are leaving this country not in disgrace, but with pride in what we have accomplished. All of you know the Finns are obliged by the armistice to use military force against German troops still on their soil after the 15th of September. We don't know what the Finns will eventually do. I can't imagine our former brothers in arms turning against us in combat, but for precaution's sake, the army will act as if operating in a hostile country. So, I call on you. If they should decide to attack, they'll find us ready. The Army High Command has decided that our 2 Jaeger regiments will cover the Army's southern flank. At first, we'll be with Combat Group East, and then, later on and further up, we'll be the Army's sole rear guard. We can be proud of the mission with which we are entrusted, and we are well prepared. With our mountain artillery and our 2 Suam anti-aircraft guns, our firepower is enormous. We have had a foretaste of what any delay, by order or by negligence, can mean. I'm determined not to let that happen again. I'm determined to bring us safely back home. I know I can rely on you, on your courage and on your tenacity, on your experience as old Karelian hands, on your faith and on your loyalty. Therefore, I know we can do it." He saluted, and the battalion responded with a thunderous cheer. As he left, the companies stood at attention, the front ranks of the 3 blocks meticulously aligned, all ready to march. In the rear, only the mules were stirring and pawing under their load of wicker baskets and the heavy weapons strapped to their backs. It was almost dark. Only a narrow strip of pale yellow light remained in the sky above the horizon, against which the black contours of the surrounding firs stood out. Some sharp commands were given, and then, by and by, a picture unfolded that we would see in endless repetition over the next months. The sequence of our companies departing in mountain order, Jaeger with their light weapons in single file, followed by the mules packed with heavy arms and ammunition, then the train with their equipment loaded on carts and drawn by more pack animals, followed again by another file of Jaeger, and so forth. After we had marched for about an hour, I caught up with Heinrich. We hadn't seen much of each other since I had returned from the hospital, and now I was glad to have him to talk to. I was curious to know his opinion about Hansen's speech. I thought it was a bright spot, uncertain as our prospects were in general. What do you say? A fine speech, but a bright spot? I don't know. Can't see it that way. Have you by chance any idea of the distance to the next port by the Arctic Ocean? 800 or 900 kilometers? Or maybe 1,000 if detours are necessary. And with every step, We'll be getting further away from where we actually want to go. And what do you think the Finns will do? You really share the battalioner's opinion? How should I know? I would expect them to reckon that the less they disturb our withdrawal, the better for both sides. Wishful thinking, I'm afraid. It's rumoured that the Finnish units are now being supervised by Russian commissars. So imagine the Finns being under that pressure, using their Motti tactics against us. For that's what the Russians want them to do. The Finns certainly know their way around better than we do. I left the implied question unanswered. After a while, Heinrich continued, even more gloomy. It'll be snowing before long, and before you know it, we'll be in heavy frost. Soon you'll be without a roof over your head. No village as far as we can march in one day, no huts, no nothing in this forlorn country the farther we go north. And the Finns will always be close on our heels. Come on, Heinrich. Next you'll fancy them rushing from the woods and cutting down the exhausted remnants of the Lapland army, like the Cossacks who beat up the remnants of Napoleon's army in the winter of 1813. I don't believe we are in for that sort of thing. We aren't a motley crowd of mercenaries on the run, but a disciplined unit with powerful fighting strength and good leadership. Quite a difference, I'd say. We'll see. I wish you were right. At least you won't deny that the test is still ahead of us. And what if we reach the Arctic Ocean? At best, we'll embark on one of those troop ships. And what then? I'll tell you. We'll have to make another 1,000 miles, or what have you, across the sea with the British Navy waiting for us where we don't expect them. And the alternative is to walk on the road. I dare not even think of it, with all the fjords and high mountains in the polar night. Really, I admire your knowledge of geography. One would think you'd been all around there before. Well, I haven't, he said flatly. But geography always was my favourite subject at school. I wonder what comes next, I said, somewhat irritated. I'll tell you. Hansen said he'd bring us safely home. Let's cut out the safely for a while. But then, what eventually will home be like? Probably Motti tactics are encircling the enemy in difficult terrain. As soon as we arrived there, we'll be sent to the Eastern Front. And if we're lucky, it'll be the West. If, on the other hand, neither happens, then it's the worst case, for then the war will be lost before we get home. Now, really, your pessimism comes close to undermining morale. I hope you won't be running around with that kind of talk. My dear Johann, I wouldn't think of talking like this to anyone else, but why should I spare you what I think is likely to come? I don't run away from it either. There must be some who are strong enough to face our prospects in less rosy colours, so they won't collapse when things turn out the way I said. Some who are indispensable for keeping up the troops' morale. He looked at me, expecting a comment, but I could only offer him a nod. Our talk ended there. Silently we marched on in the dark. The steady motion of our steps and the muffled noises of the pack animals and their equipment were somehow reassuring. He had taught me a little lesson, and I had seen that there was a hard core in him I had not sensed before. I wasn't too sure I could find the same within myself. The battalion reached Kittila late in October. 4 weeks and 250 kilometres of marching were behind us. We had crossed Finland from east to west and were already far beyond the Arctic Circle. Actually, the small village was nothing but the place of a major break on our march to the north, but in my memory it is a turning point. From then on, my own perception of the war changed. It was there that I was told of Manhard's death and of the bitter battles between former brothers in arms down by the sea at Tornio and at Kemi earlier that month. Telling of Kittila, therefore, is telling a tale of sadness and doom, of broken words and dying hope. On the day of our arrival, the division's support echelon was just about to move further north. The place was swarming with trucks, ambulances, trains, and, in particular, many wounded and medical personnel. The field hospital should have been displaced days ago, but casualties from the fighting in the south still kept coming in, delaying the hospital's departure. They said that only recently a transport had arrived, which had made a detour through Swedish territory, a rumour I couldn't make sense of until later on. I spotted Herweg, Manhard's companion in the reconnaissance battalion near the hospital. It was his plastered leg he was briskly swinging between two crutches that first caught my attention. When he passed by, there was a moment of uncertainty on both sides before I recognized him, and he remembered. He said he had been wounded near Tornio and had arrived with many other casualties a few days earlier when the field hospital had been removed from Rovaniemi to Kittila. When I asked him about Manhard, he evaded all further questions. He had to move on, he said. It was urgent, and couldn't I come to see him in the evening in the hospital? Since Herweg had so abruptly broken off our encounter, I was left in a state of alarm. Tornio? I remembered that name mentioned some weeks ago. A town right at the Swedish border, linked with the Swedish town of Haparanda by a bridge over the Tornio River that flows into the northern arc of the Gulf of Bothnia. It was a medic who mentioned it when we brought one of our casualties to his dressing station. It was on the day when Russian fighter planes had caught us on the Esmirstrasse, the Arctic Sea Road, northwest of Rovaniemi. They left a ghastly scene of wounded and dying men and animals lying in their blood on a site which only moments before had been so idyllic. As we waited for more ambulances, a medic told us that the Finns had captured one of our hospital trains at Tornio and that fighting was going on there. Now I recalled this information, which then had caused great bitterness among us. To capture a hospital train, cut off from overseas transportation and about to turn to a new destination in the north, was the last thing we would have expected from our former brothers in arms. The action seemed quite unnecessary for any conceivable purpose. Later on, there had been more bits of information confirming Manhard's forebodings. Strong Finnish forces had landed at Tornio early in October, and more troops were moving up from the south, using brand-new German assault guns delivered only that summer and thrown into the battle against the Russian offensive in South Karelia. Our supply troops had been forced to abandon the area, and combat troops were sent in, the reconnaissance battalion among them. The casualties on both sides were said to be heavy. In our own battalion, all of us by then realized the Finnish troops had become our enemies. It had been only a matter of time before they would attack our units, forming the southeastern flank of the German army in retreat, to destroy at least its rear guard. Yet, instead of withdrawing to the west as fast as possible as we had hoped, our battalion had to suit the army's time schedule and linger now and then in various temporary positions. Detained there, we would stare through our glasses into the woods and send out patrols to search the surrounding areas. So far, the Finns let our withdrawal remain undisturbed, but we never lost the feeling of being watched. Eventually, at Rovaniemi, we had slipped over the bridge shortly before it was blown up, past the lines of our sister regiment, glad to leave the terrain behind where a major clash with Finnish forces was most likely to occur. Eventually, it was Regiment 12 that first crossed swords with the Finns, for them an ill-fated venture that delayed the regiment's progress for no more than half a day. On the road to Kittila, our battalion had increased the rate of march to gain time. It added to the strain of our daily exercise, 30 kilometres on average. True, we were travelling lightly, carrying only our rifles and submachine guns, while the machine guns and the ammunition were handily strapped to the backs of mules, our faithful companions who trotted along among us. The weather had turned bad, however. It rained, and we had frost overnight. The winter, however, was late that year. As yet, there was no snow on our way to Kittila. We saw only a few hilltops wearing white caps. Herweg was waiting for me at the entrance of the hospital. Signs of dissolution were visible everywhere. We squeezed through a narrow corridor and a small room, poorly lit by some carbide lamps and full of stretchers with wounded. In between, medical personnel, overworked but quietly efficient, were going about their duties. The sombre atmosphere matched my apprehension. Herweg led me to a quiet corner to another casualty who turned his back on us and was sitting on a wooden box, reclining against the wall, smoking, his right shoulder and arm in plaster casts. The wounded man turned. "Hey, Alter! What the hell are you doing here?" "Good to see you," he said, cool as ever. "I knew you'd come. Herweg told me." He stretched out his left hand. "Dot." "My arm got worse, I'm afraid," he said with a forced smile. "I thought you were on your way home long ago," I said, sitting down on another box opposite him, while Herweg took a seat beside him. "Well, I ain't," It's only part of the story you've come here for. I'll tell you later, he said, and turned to Herweg. Herweg took out a pack of cigarettes, offered me one, and fumbled one out for himself very slowly and awkwardly. There was a pause while he kept staring at the ground and took long draws from his cigarette. What happened? I broke the silence. He's dead, Voss. He fell in a raid at Tornio 3 weeks ago, he said in a low voice, as if trying not to hurt. I wish I had better news. It was as if I had known all the time. As we took long draws, our cigarettes glowed in the dark, a darkness much like our own gloom. It was his own idea, Herweg continued. Of course, afterwards it's always the same question. Was it inevitable? Couldn't we have done better? I can only say it was his way. He wanted to do it. He said to me, let's get them out of there. They are wounded. They can't help themselves. It was the wounded, the transport the Finns had captured, who were his main concern at the end. I take it you were with him on the raid? In a way, both of us were, the Alta cut in. Herweg was with the patrol, and I was on the transport. How is that? You said the transport was captured, I said. Come on, tell me the whole story, right from the start. As you probably know, we, the reconnaissance battalion, were stationed between Oulu and Kemi in September, Herweg began. At the end of the month, a violent storm broke loose that lasted at least 2 days. Remember? It wasn't quite over yet when the Finns landed at Tomio. Over the next 2 days, more of them arrived and seized the town. Until then, we had still been on rather friendly terms with the Finns. As far as I know, the local commanders at Kemi arranged to keep the road and the bridges clear for our withdrawal. The fresh troops in Tomio, however, changed the situation entirely. They had already snatched all supply depots and trains and kidnapped that casualty transport of ours. No doubt they were up to a lot more monkey business. Something had to be done. It was a hospital train, wasn't it? We've heard about it, I put in. No, it wasn't, the Alta said. We had already left the train and were about to start north by a convoy of our own trucks and ambulances. So, 2 days later, as part of an army combat group, we mounted an attack to regain Tomio, Herweg continued. It soon became a nasty fight, artillery, direct fire, and mungos on both sides. The Finns fiercely resisted by taking advantage of the place and firing from all the barrels they had. We, on the other hand, came down from the hills, blasting our way to the edge of the town, and from there advanced house by house. Our main target was the road to the north that had to be cleared. Slowly, over the day, we managed to take it, but our casualties were terrible. Orders came for us to stop, to hold our present positions, and to secure the area to the south. And right then, almost by chance, Manhard, who was searching the area with his glasses, spotted the casualty convoy. German vehicles, mostly Red Cross, were exposed to our view through a gap in the wooded terrain. He pointed in that direction, and then I too saw them through my own glasses. The vehicles, about 10, were assembled in a grove on the peninsula, the Finnish beachhead. "What do you think?" he said to me, and from that look of his I knew instantly he had already made up his mind. "Herweg," he said, "pick 7 men right away. Make sure all have submachine guns. Get 1 machine gun and some hand grenades. As soon as it's dark, we'll go get them out of there." The way things had developed, it didn't look as if we were going to throw the Finns out of the beachhead. Only a quick and determined raid could do the job of rescuing our wounded. Otherwise, they would be moved out of the area and be lost, ending up imprisoned somewhere in Siberia. "Speed and resolution," Manhard said, "is our only chance." Herweg lit another cigarette before he continued. "We got permission for our operation and departed as soon as it was dark. We reached the beach unnoticed and then stole along the edge of the wooded terrain on high ground towards the peninsula. Our plan was to eliminate the Finnish sentries and, assuming the convoy was ready for departure, immediately make for the road. We were about 300 metres from the vehicles when we stopped and Manhard went ahead for close observation. We were to follow on his flashlight signal. I watched him through my glasses, a lonely figure, first stalking, then crouching across a wide, bare stretch that extended towards the edge of the grove. Then it all happened within 1 or 2 minutes. Somehow the sentries must have heard a noise or seen him. A flare went up, exposing the dark figure on the light sand. There was some shouting, and then almost instantly they opened fire. He made a last effort, fumbling with his submachine gun when he was riddled by submachine gun bursts at close range. "Wasn't your machine gun giving him cover?" I asked, exasperated. "That's what you were there for, weren't you?" "No, we couldn't unless we used the convoy itself for a target." He shook his head in despair. "Really, we couldn't help it. It was only when they came forward from the vehicles and were closing in on him that our machine gun opened fire, but then it was too late." "Then you left him there? How did you know he was dead?" I asked. "I can assure you he was dead right away," the alter cut in. He began his own extraordinary story. "Death must have come instantly," he said. He saw it all from the moment the flare was fired, and he peered out from the back of his truck. But Manhard hadn't died in vain. Using the momentary confusion of the sentries, the Alte and the ones who could move about managed to regain their weapons and eliminate the guards. In no time, the transport leader, a medical doctor, had given orders for a quick escape, and their vehicles thundered towards the road.